Welcome back to Family Twist. And if you've been with us for the last two episodes, you know that Brad Yule's journey has been nothing short of astounding. He went into this meeting with his biological father thinking it was just a formality. One visit, checkmark, and then he'd be done. But as you're about to hear, things didn't exactly go according to plan. What started as a reluctant introduction turned into an 8-hour conversation inside Angola prison that completely changed the trajectory of Brad's life. This is the final part of his incredible story. Let's dive in.
I'm still very, very compartmentalized. We're just talking. I'm still calling him Jim at this point. I don't mind him calling me son. I probably mind it more than I'm willing to admit. I just go with it. But, I had a dad. I had a good dad. And I'm like, I'm not calling him dad because I've already got a dad. He's still alive. I'm not sharing that title with somebody. So we get it all set up and I make the trip to Angola. And he's telling me when I'm 2 days before I make the trip, he's like, listen, I know the warden. And I mean, Angola has 6,000 plus inmates. And I'm like, I built the image of who I'm going to meet in prison. And number one is he's full of crap. So telling me, you know, the warden and you're going to get me this extra long visit. I'm like, sure you are. I'm going to be there for an hour like everybody else. But great. Tell me your story. At the end of the day, my plan, he didn't know this. He does now. We've talked about it since then. But my plan was I'm going to meet him. I'm going to find out whatever I can. And then we're done. We might email back and forth some just to keep in touch. But I have checked my box of I met my only living bio parent. And we're going to be done with this. So that was my full intention when I went to meet him. And then he screwed that all up. So totally his fault. So go ahead.
I was just saying, not the guy that you thought he was going to be.
No. So far the opposite of what I expected to meet. So, I expected somebody that was full of it. I already said that. No responsibility. I mean, most of my life has been around people that everything happened because somebody else did something that made something bad happen to them. It was never, I made a bad choice and here I sit in my own bad choices. It was the world was against me. And had the world not been against me, my life would have been fine. It's not because I made a lot of bad choices about my life.
Right. And,
I can't speak from the always known adopted side. And Kendall, you can chime in here and tell me. But, I feel like from the DNA surprise side, I'm already reeling from everybody short of my wife that's an adult in my life has been lying to me at some level. They've all been covering something up. So trust-wise, I'm not trusting at all rolling into this. I'm like, well, it's just one other adult that's full of crap in my life because everybody else has been so far. So I get to the prison, go inside, get checked in, get put on. I studied Angola Penitentiary when I was in college because it was close to where I went to school. So I knew of it, knew that it was a massive, it's like, I could be completely wrong. I want to say it's like 16,000 acres. It's this huge place. But so I get there and they put me on an airplane bus, like those little shuttle buses in an airport, and drive me more than a mile inside this prison. And I'm looking around going, it's like field after field. Like you don't even look like you're in prison at some points. And I'm going, well, this sucks because I don't know where I am. They're going to drop me off somewhere that if something bad happens, I don't know how you leave this place. Because, I mean, there's, it's prison. There's interconnecting roads everywhere. The prison camp that they dropped me off to meet him at was a mile and a half away from the gate to get into the prison. I couldn't even see the main gate to the prison where I'm at. And I'm like, this is awful.
That's weird.
Now, the upside was I'd been a cop, so I had been to prison. I had dealt with people in there. So there was the upside to that nothing was that new. When I started my law enforcement career, I worked for 2.5, 3 years in the Dallas County Jail, which was a really big, large county jail. So the actual place itself wasn't a new experience. Doors buzz, gates crash, close behind you. None of that was like, oh my God, that was something I'd done when I was in my 20s. So those weren't new experiences, but still just being there on the other side of it was very weird. So I get led to the visitation room finally, and I'm sitting there waiting in this There's other people in the visiting room. It wasn't like a little window visitation. It was a big day room filled with tables. So other people are waiting for visits. I'm watching people file in and out. All of a sudden, this guy comes in, and I'm like, "Oh God, that's me when I'm in my 70s. That's my bio dad. Crap. Oh, now what do you do?" I hadn't really thought far enough ahead to what happens when he shows up here. So he walked in. We did the whole half hug, half dude back slappy thing, and we sit down at this table, and I am mute. I don't know what to say. And he starts. He said, "Well, son, I want to be honest with you," which was the worst thing in the world to say, because anybody who's ever told me they want to be honest with me is just starting a really long lie. So I go, "Well, and here we go. Exactly what I expected." I actually almost felt more comfortable, because I'm like, "Well, here's his BS story. We're going to hear it now. You're getting what you expected. That's okay. This was a one and done thing anyway. No big deal." And he goes, "I could tell you that I killed somebody because I was an alcoholic and a drug addict at the time, because I was doing drugs and I was an alcoholic back then. But that wouldn't be the truth. I killed somebody because somebody paid me to do it, and I regret it, and I can't fix it." And I just sat there, because I was like, "Oh no, I think he just told the truth." And then it got worse, because he starts telling me all this other stuff he's done. Pre-prison and being in prison, about how he's lived in prison, what he was doing before he murdered somebody and ended up in prison. And the more he's talking, the more part of me is being enamored, because I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is an honest adult that's laying it all out here." And the other part of me is going, "You should shut up, because I would never know any of this."
Right.
You're in prison for a thing, actually two things. He escaped once. So he's in prison for murder and escape. I knew those things. He had covered those two. And I'm like, the rest of this stuff, if you never told me, I would not have any way to find out. And he just keeps going. And I'm like, "Oh my God, just shh." But at the same time, the more he talks, the more I'm going, wow, he really wants to own up to who he is. And never in any of it was an excuse for anything. It was just, this was the person I was. He'll say to this day, I was a horrible person. And I can't go back and fix that part of me. Here I am today, but if you want to know why I'm here because I was a bad person for a long time. My whole plan was to get lied to, brush that off, and roll back out the door.
Yeah.
So was he right about being able to stay longer than an hour?
I was there for 8 hours.
Oh.
He lied about nothing. He knew the warden. He pointed the warden out when the warden walked through. They actually knew. And I'm like, oh, everything he said was the truth. And that's really hard to wrap your head around, because it was for me, because I'm like, no. He was supposed to lie about everything. And here he is just being an open book. And that was not how that was supposed to go. That was one of the biggest downsides to meeting the way we did, was I got 8 hours with my biological father with no way to write anything down, write a note, record anything. It was being fed through a fire hose with no way to try to retain anything. And I'm just sitting there going, I'm not going to remember half of this, and I want to know all of it.
It's interesting for me, because I think that in some ways, being there and knowing you needed to take full advantage of having him there was probably profound. I mean, conversely, when I met my biological father, I felt like he's not an inquisitive man. Let me say that nicely. And I'm the opposite. And, so he didn't ask me questions. I'm not saying he wasn't interested in learning, but he still to this day, he's not inquisitive at all. But he lives in the moment, and that's pretty much it. So in some ways, I think I would have appreciated having 8 concentrated hours where I felt like I could, but you're right. Drinking from a fire hose for sure.
But I mean, you're right. There is an advantage to this dude can't go anywhere. We're not in a coffee shop where he can be like, "And Kendall, you have offended me and I'm done with this." No, you're stuck. We're in prison. We're together.
Yep.
You have to sit at this table and deal with me because you let me come. Yep. So I mean, there is a huge advantage to the trapped part.
When did you start thinking like this is not going to be a one and done, obviously?
I don't think the realization hit me until I got on the bus to leave his camp. And it was on, I mean, it's probably 20-minute bus ride from where we had our visitation to back out of the prison. And that's when I really felt like the first time I could digest anything that just happened. And I had brought my wife with me to Baton Rouge, which is about 45 minutes from the prison. I promised myself I was not taking my wife to prison. That didn't seem like a cool thing to do. So I had left her at a hotel and I had gone here, and I'm like, when I get done, I'll call you. I'm expecting an hour. It's now 4:00 in the afternoon. I've literally been there all day. And I called her. And so I couldn't have my phone till like my phone was locked in my car outside the prison. So
Yeah.
As soon as I get all the way out, get in the car, I call her and I'm like, and she's like, well, how did it go? And I was like, well, I like him and I don't know what to do with that because that was not my goal. I mean, it was one thing to think, okay, well, I'll get to know this guy and maybe he's an okay guy. But I literally left liking him. And I'm like, oh crap, what do I do with this? Because I've still got a live mother, a live father. They were not down for this reunion process at all. So I'm out on my own doing this stuff. They're aging too. So I'm helping them. There's so much going on. And I'm like, this was not how I wanted this to go. It sounds awful, but it would have been in some levels easier had it been that one and done. Because it's like, okay, and we're done with this one. Mm-hmm. But to walk out and say, no, after my little 20-minute thought process, I like this guy and I want to talk to him more. Oh, no.
So what happens next?
Well, so what happened next was I met him, I think, on February 18th of 2020. And we were emailing back and forth. March 13th of 2020, my adoptive dad dies pretty unexpectedly. He'd been in the hospital for a week, had been home for a week, and was gone. I honestly think from COVID. Back then we didn't really, it was the week before they actually started saying COVID was COVID. So I don't know, but I think that's what it was. So he died. And I think one of my big regrets that I had told myself I was going to do and didn't do in time was pull all these emails from the prison server because I can't get to them anymore. But I think I sent him one saying, hey, listen, my adoptive dad just died. I'm going to go incommunicado for a while because I've got a lot to deal with. It had, along with my adoptive dad dying, the November before my adoptive dad died, because like I said, we were rock solid secret keepers, was when we figured out that my mom had Alzheimer's and he'd been covering that up for a couple of years. So now I had adoptive dad has passed away. Absolutely. Through therapy, things have gotten a little more complicated with my view of him, but then absolutely my hero. So, I mean, I've lost him. I've inherited this person that I have struggled with my whole life who is not capable of managing for herself and does not know that because my dad has covered that up even from her. So for close to a month, maybe a little bit longer, I had told him we weren't going to talk and we didn't because I was doing my best to tread water every day.
Mm-hmm.
And then we got back in touch with each other. And the more we talked, and this, I'm going to shorten this as best I can. And you're welcome to ask questions because I know more about it than I'm going to talk about just because I don't want to drag your podcast out forever into this. But when my father pled guilty to murder, he was sentenced to what's called a 10-6 life sentence, which means in Louisiana in 1972, if you were given a life sentence, you were eligible for a flat release or parole in 10 years and 6 months. That's what life meant. Didn't mean you had to, but you were eligible for that. If you go back to your history classes, you'll remember that 1972 is also when the Supreme Court did the moratorium on the death penalty. And Louisiana had this panic of, we have these death row prisoners that may be all eligible for release if we don't have a death penalty anymore. So they met as the legislator and said, if we've given you life in prison, you now have to serve 20 years before you're eligible for parole. Well, my father was a year into what he thought was a 10-year 6 sentence, and now he's doing 20 years before he's eligible for parole. Fast forward to their next legislative session, and they're realizing that, oh, wait, most of these guys that are death rowers have already done 20 years. So this isn't working. So they up it and say, if we've given you life in prison, you now have to do 40 years. And what they're doing is they're retroactively applying this sentence to anybody currently serving time. So now he's looking, I think this would have been 4 years into his what he thought was a 10-year sentence. He's now at a 40-year sentence, guaranteed before he looks at release. Well, Louisiana being Louisiana, they have another legislative session the following 2 years. And they say, we've rethought all this, and we're Louisiana, and if we gave you life in prison, we mean you die here. So anybody that's prison sentence says life is now life without parole. And this would have been, I think, about 6.5 years into what he thought was a 10-year sentence. So he went from, I pled guilty, I have the eligibility to get out, to 6 years later, I am not eligible for parole ever. And there's not an appeal process for that. These are legislative changes. So when I met him, he's doing life without parole. I am never going to say how long somebody should do in prison for murder. If you killed my parents or my wife, I want you to die in prison for murder. I get it. I'm not saying that should be any other way. My flip side of that is I'm kind of a strong constitutionalist. And I feel like if the state makes an agreement with you, they can't just retroactively change that on a whim. It would be like if I bought a car and every few years the dealership called and said, hey, Brad, that car is now worth $4,000 more than we told you it was. So I took issue with that side of it, not the fact that he could spend the rest of his life in prison, because he did take somebody else's life. And as all of this was happening and COVID was going on, it was awful because I could not go to see him. All I could do is talk to him on the phone, and it is literally every movie you've seen. You're receiving a call from Angola State Penitentiary from Jim. Do you want to accept this call? So, we had 10-minute calls like that. Those were all monitored. So it also very much limits what you're going to say. Face-to-face at a visitation table, we could talk about anything. On the phone, everything is recorded. Is it checked? Who knows? I know it was sometimes because we had a visit cut short that still baffles me to this day. But so what COVID did was Louisiana allowed for video visitation. So I was now allowed, I think it was 15-minute video chats with him. So I could actually see him face to face, still monitored, still very limited on what we're going to talk about. But I can at least see him, which, it's like we're doing right now. You just feel a little bit closer when you're seeing somebody you're talking to rather than just talking to a voice.
Absolutely.
But are they monitored? Absolutely. Because one time we're in the middle of a visit and the screen goes black. He emailed me the next day and said, apparently your visit was cut short because you violated rule such and such. I pull up the inmate visitation book. I had just come back from the gym. I was wearing a tank top. Tank tops are not allowed visitation attire. Somebody had popped on the video, seen me in a tank top, and just gone click and turned us off.
Wow.
So they did watch.
Wow.
Each other on kind of a different level. My dad died in March of 2020. For Christmas of 2020, I got to spend 15 minutes with my bio dad, hiding upstairs in my bedroom. We didn't want her to know. Having video Christmas with my father who's in prison. And as we're getting to know each other, I'm getting more and more into this mindset. He even admits, absolutely in there for a reason he should be in there. No, there's no debate. He said, I killed somebody and I'm sitting in prison because I did that. But the New Orleans DA at that time had started a program or was pushing for a bill that would allow these guys that had gone in for life sentences to be eligible for release like they were when they were initially sentenced. And what was strange was they had done this in kind of waves. They had recognized the 40 to life without parole and the 20 to life without parole and rectified both of those decisions. But they had forgotten there were still 40 guys, and that was all that was left because you have to figure all these guys were sentenced 72 and prior. So they were none of them were young. There were only 40 of them left that weren't 20 to life or 40 to life. They were 10-6 to life. And those legislative changes they had done like in 2017 didn't affect those 40 guys that had started at 10-6. So he had recognized this and had started this bill that got passed that if the court that sentenced you and the district attorney's office that prosecuted you could come up with a new sentence, that was your new sentence. So what he was doing in Orleans Parish was he would come and he would say, Kendall, how long have you been in prison? And you'd say, 49 years, 7 days. And he would say, well, your new sentence is 49 years and 8 days. We're releasing you tomorrow. So they were just cutting people loose, one after the other. The problem was my father had been sentenced out of Caddo Parish. This law that they had written was an option for every DA's office. It was not at all a requirement. So you had to ask for this to happen. I feel better saying this because I can't feel like there's any way I'll get in trouble for it. I 100% cheated. I sent every email to Caddo Parish from my police email because I knew even if they were going to tell me to pound sand, they would at least answer me because I was a police officer. So I started emailing back and forth with Caddo Parish. I spent a year emailing back and forth with one of their super nice lady, assistant district attorney. She asked me to put together a file, an actual hard copy file for her of all of his prison accomplishments, his discipline record, his everything that had his prison stuff in it. Send her the physical file. They wouldn't take digital copies. So we did all that. And over a year, we'd correspond off and on because this was not, she was the head of their appeals process. So she was dealing with much more than just, oh, will you review my father's case? But after a year, she reached out and said, listen, I've talked to the DA and where the DA stands is we're not doing this. He's not interested in opening a can of worms like this because once you do one, you've got to do more and he's not going to do it. He can't be made to do it. So we're kind of at a dead end. Right. But then she said, but there is legislation that we think is coming next year that may still help your father's case. So look up this House bill and just kind of keep an eye on it. Supposedly this other legislation's coming. Here's the thing. So it turned out she was right. And that following year, they introduced a bill through a group called the Parole Project in Louisiana, who I had reached out to when all of this started and had told me, listen, your father is life without parole, which means there's nothing we can do for him. Well, they had made this push for all 10-6 lifers. They wanted a bill that said anybody that was sentenced to a 10-6 life sentence is immediately eligible for parole. We're not saying you should all be released because you may be a horrible inmate. You may be in there killing your cellie every chance you get, but you should at least have the ability to be considered. So I reached back out to the Parole Project because it turned out that the man that runs the Parole Project had been in prison with my father and knew him. So once again, I didn't use my police email to cheat, but I Facebook stalked him. I found his personal Facebook page and I started sending him personal messages I stopped contacting the Parole Project. I just started contacting him being like, hey, you know my father. This is who I am. I want to talk to you, blah, blah, blah. And finally he responded back and he said, listen, I do know your dad and yeah, let's talk. I don't know where this law is going. But while all this is going on in the background, my sister has been diagnosed with stage 4 ovarian cancer, gone through all of the treatments, had some success. It slowed down. It would remetastasize. It would slow down. So that's going on in the background while we're dealing with pop stuff. And it's now March of 2022. My sister's basically been told, listen, we've got one more thing we're doing, but ultimately you're going to die of ovarian cancer. We cannot save you. So, we just want you to be able to have time to come to peace with what you want to do. Well, one of her dreams was to get married in Las Vegas to her then common law husband. And they couldn't figure out how to get to Vegas. So Pam and I figured out a way to get them to Vegas. They wanted, you can decide what you want to think of my family. My sister desperately wanted to get married on 420 in Vegas. So we'll just let that say what it says.
Yeah.
And so we got that arranged. She said, well, if y'all are doing this for us, do you want to come be our witnesses? And I'm like, that'd be amazing. That, because she and I'm watching my sister die, and that's a whole nother long, crappy story. But we had gotten super close by then. Now I'm going to get to be at her wedding. That seems like a really cool brother thing to get to do for my little sister, even though I know it's not going to be a long-term thing. So we get that all set up. The Wednesday of her wedding, I'm getting dressed that morning and my phone rings and it's Andrew from the Parole Project. He said, well, it looks like this bill may actually happen. Because I told him, anything I can do to help, let me know. Because I would really like to see Pop get this opportunity. Well, he said, it looks like this is happening. Any chance you could be in Louisiana on Monday? And he said, well, you're one of the few people that is a living relative of a 10-6 lifer. And the fact that you're a police officer, we want to use to our advantage. And we want you to come testify at the House Criminal Justice Committee about why they should pass this bill. And I'm still sorting through. I'm at my sister's wedding in Vegas, and I'm like, okay, yeah, I guess I'll be in Louisiana on Monday. So we get her wedding. We have all of our wedding fun. Fly back Saturday. Sunday, I am in the car driving to Baton Rouge from Texas. And Monday morning, I'm sitting in the Louisiana legislature testifying about a bill about why they should consider releasing people like my father. And that goes well. The committee votes in favor of it. It goes that following week to, I think, the full house. The full house votes in favor of it. And I'm in contact with Andrew back and forth. And I said, what's next? He said, well, the same thing happens with the Senate. And I said, okay, do you need me to come testify at the Senate? And he goes, I don't know. Let's just see how it flows from here. Well, then I think it was June-ish. He called me again and said, yeah, I want you to come back and testify for the Senate because we really want to try to push this thing through. They've made some changes that we don't like, basically, but that's a strange place. The change they made to the bill was if you had a 10-6 life sentence and you took your United States constitutional right to a trial, you were not eligible for parole. You were only going to be eligible if you'd pled guilty because otherwise you'd been a pain to the state. So they were still hoping to get the full bill passed and make anybody that had gotten the 10-6 eligible. So they said, would you come back and testify again? I was like, sure. So back, did the same thing for their Senate Criminal Justice Committee, testified, answered the questions they had for me about the whys and why I thought as a police officer it should happen. I had to go to my police administration saying, listen, I want to speak as a police officer, but I will absolutely not speak on behalf of the police department because you may not necessarily agree with some of the things I'm about to say. But I still hold, whether you agree with them or not, I'm still a police officer. So I do that. And then the week later, watch it pass the Senate on YouTube. I never thought I would be watching YouTube votes for the Louisiana legislature, but I was fascinated by that when I sat there and watched. So it passed. I called Pop the minute I saw it pass, or sent him an email to call me, called him, and he called and I said, listen, it's done. You, as soon as the governor signs this, are parole eligible after 40-ish years of not being. And, he said, great. So then my next call was to Andrew from the Parole Project. And I said, listen, here's where I become the bad guy and ask for my piece of the pie. All I want is I want Pop to be first. But, at this point, he would have been 77. He's still the same dude that had the massive widowmaker heart attack and died in prison and they revived. And I'm like, I don't, I had already lost a parent at this point. So I'm like, it's becoming very clear to me that there's an age where I'm losing my parents. And it was awful to me to think that he could have this in sight and die sitting in there watching. Right. So Andrew said, absolutely. We'll see if we can make that happen. That seems fair. So he ended up being the second parole hearing for 10-6ers. The only reason he was the second was, and I think this is most prisons, so this won't be me bashing Louisiana, but when you're coming up for parole hearing, you have to have a clean discipline record. If you get any disciplinary infraction coming up to your parole hearing, you're just taken off the calendar. Well, they had a guy that was up for parole, not a 10-6er, get a disciplinary infraction in a separate prison from where my father was. And they stuck a 10-6er in his slot because they needed somebody to go to that spot. So Pop ended up being the second parole hearing. And that would have been November, I guess, 16th. I'm back in Angola State Penitentiary sitting in this room. And it was hard on a lot of levels. A, it was terrifying. B, the family of the man whose life he took spoke out against his parole, which, I mean, no ill feelings. You put me in their shoes. Oh, I'm doing it. So can't be mad at him over it. So I'm listening to them talk about, and he's having to listen to it too, because everything was by video except for people speaking on behalf of my father for the hearing. Even the parole board was on video. Nobody was in that room except me, my father, one of my father's friends, the attorney representing him for the parole project, trying to work him through this, and some prison guards. So, we're all watching these people talk about the devastation that his choice created in their life for the rest of their lives. I mean, some of them had been to prison for drunk driving, to become alcoholics. So I speak at the parole hearing. A couple of his friends speak at the parole hearing. And then we're down to the vote, which was, I couldn't have cast a movie better. There was this lady, the parole hearing is a 3-person panel, and it has to be a unanimous vote. All 3 have to say yes. As soon as one says no, you're done. And there's a lady that reminds me, I don't know what she did for her regular job, but she should be a kindergarten teacher because she is engaged in everything you say. She's nodding and she's smiling and she's happy that you're talking to her. The guy next to her just is kind of there. He doesn't seem like he's opposed to anything, but he's not certainly for anything. And the third guy looked like he wanted to be anywhere else than where he was. He just looked mad. And I'm like, well, damn, this is not going to be a unanimous 3-person vote. So, and they actually voted in that same order I listed him. So they get to her and she's like, absolutely. Here's all the great things he's done. I think he should have an opportunity. The second guy starts and he says, we really have to weigh, and he lays out, and it's all very legitimate, where does punishment for a crime turn into rehabilitation? Does rehabilitation matter to us, or are we truly just trying to punish you? And he lays it out, but he eventually votes in favor too, and we end up at the mad guy. And the mad guy just starts off with, people go to prison to be punished for what they do. Oh no, here we go. Mm-hmm. He talked the longest, but about halfway through his talk, he suddenly says, but we do have to look at rehabilitation. I'm like, oh, maybe there's a chance here. And I always get choked up when I talk about this part. I did it this weekend, and it's still, I don't know why anymore. But so he gets done and he votes yes. And they had told us before the hearing, because there's also a group of people of the family of a man he's killed watching this, thou shalt not display emotion in this hearing until we say so. So they all vote yes. And, we're all sitting there just waiting to do something. And they finally say, okay, the camera's off. And we all just burst into tears, start hugging. He's crying. His friend that I'm with about this tiny little lady is about broken my forearm because she is just wrenching it in half while people are testifying. And all of a sudden, he's leaving prison. So we walk out of the parole room, we sit down, and they're like, it takes a day to process paperwork. We'll be releasing him tomorrow around noon. And, I'm ecstatic. B, when all of this started, my wife and I were very much on the same page, and we stayed on the same page and kind of grew as this whole thing changed. But when this first started, we were both on the page of, well, the one thing is, it's not like this dude's ever showing up at our doorstep. And we've gone from that to I'm sitting in a room trying to get him out of prison. So now he absolutely could show up at our doorstep because I've changed some things. One of those fun benefits of being a police officer was we get back out in the main waiting room. There were probably 12 guys going up for parole that day. And I think 2 out of 12 got denied. But I hugged so many random dudes that just came out looking for somebody to share a little excitement with, that they weren't staying in this hellhole anymore.
Yeah.
It gave me a whole new perspective on what I've done for my job for all these years that I had never experienced. But so I'm talking to Andrew from the Parole Project, and he said, he actually doesn't report the parole plan because we're in Texas, he's in Louisiana. He has to be approved to come to Texas because he's being paroled in Louisiana. Texas has to accept him, and Louisiana has to be willing to send him. So parole plan step 1 is go to transition house. I mean, you have to really put on your way back cap. But he went to prison in 1972. Things have changed just a little bit now. And that he wasn't totally technologically backwards. Like they had, if you've ever seen a prison movie and you see the old TV that has the clear plastic back case so you can't hide contraband in it, he had a Nexus tablet that looked just like that. Clear plastic back, but that was where they watched movies. That's where he got his email. That's where he did all his communication from. So he had worked like a touchscreen things before, but still a wee bit different from 1972. So he had to go to a transition house. But Andrew said, the transition house actually doesn't kick off till Monday. He's being released on Thursday. You're a police officer. We're not worried about him getting in trouble. Do you want him till Monday? And I'm like, oh, yeah. So we spent our first 3 days. It was me, his friend that helped me work through his parole, and him in Baton Rouge, going out to eat, hanging out. I actually met some people he did time with. It was a whole nother experience. I mean, see people that had, A, meet people that have been in prison that I hadn't met before, but B, hear stories about what it was like in there, especially in the early 70s. I mean, A, prison reform hasn't reformed near as much as it should, but B, back then, I mean, he flat told me they were in a 90-man dorm. Night count was at 9. Morning count was at 6. So from 9 at night till 6 in the morning, the guards did their count, walked out of the dorm, locked the door with all of them in there, and they didn't come back till 6 in the morning. Anything you could get away with between 9 and 6 was fair game. Killing somebody? He told me stories of waking up with a dude laying in a pool of blood next to his bunk, dead. He slept through a stabbing. So just a hellhole of a place. We got him for 3 days and then a transition house, I think, for a month when he was approved to go to Texas. I drove to Louisiana, picked him up, and drove him to Texas.
He lives near you now?
He's about 45 minutes away. He's actually, it's a fun and strange story. I mean, the serendipity that we all talk about in all these discoveries is weird enough, but early on when we were getting to know each other, he told me, he said, I'd like you to talk to my girlfriend. And I was already like, how do you have a girlfriend? You've been in prison forever. And he's like, well, my girlfriend is my ex-wife and we've kind of rekindled things. And I think you already know her. And my first thought was, of all of the things that have happened, I am 100% sure I don't know your damn girlfriend. There is no way. And he said, well, her name is Fanny, which is a weird name. And she works in HR at the city that you work at. And she was my HR rep. I'd known her for 18 years. And she had no idea who I was. So yes, he was right. Once again, I knew his girlfriend.
Bizarre.
So fast forward, he got out, spent a little time with his friend that had helped me get him out. And the more he and Fanny talked, they rekindled things, and he now lives with her.
Very cool.
And they're like two high school kids rekindling a relationship. It's very cute.
Well, he's making up for
50 years.
Yeah, exactly. So much lost time.
Have you shared your love of horror and art with him?
Yes. So that was one of the interesting discoveries from all of this is before he chose, we'll just call it a life of crime, he was a junior draftsman. He's drawn his whole life. He paints. He turns wood. It turned out that all these artistic urges that I grew up ignoring because I grew up in a house of very much a sports family, all came very naturally. I have bowls he's turned in my house. I have a huge painting. He had never painted. He had drawn because he was a draftsman, but figured he could paint. He learned to paint watching Bob Ross VHS tapes in Angola State Penitentiary is how he learned to paint.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, yes, I'm settling into this new who I am, but it's all making more sense because, all of this stuff comes naturally to me because it's in my DNA.
Yeah. I love it. It's come full circle.
Yeah, we have shared the art stuff, and then he's very much an action movie person, but my half brother and I have also taken him to see a handful of horror movies that he seems to really, he likes action. So cool. If it's scary action, he'll go. If it's action, he'll go.
That's cool. That's very, very cool. On the Horror Heals podcast, we always ask as the last question, who is your favorite final person in a horror movie?
Yep. Have y'all watched Strange Darling yet?
So that is not ringing a bell.
So
we will tonight.
My favorite final person is, I think she's titled in the credits Lady. She calls herself a couple times the Electric Lady. She is my favorite. Before then, I would have said what so many other people said on here, which is Jamie Lee Curtis and all the Halloween movies, because that's by far my favorite franchise. But I loved her character and how she played that character out through that movie.
Oh, definitely have to check it out. I love discovering something new.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for your time and for the beautiful artwork. We can't thank you enough for that. And there it is, the unexpected turn of events that took Brad from "this is just one meeting" to standing in front of lawmakers fighting for his father's chance at freedom. It's a story of discovery, of rewriting expectations, and of realizing that sometimes the people we least expect to connect with can change everything. Brad, we can't thank you enough for sharing this raw and powerful journey with us. And to all of you listening, if this story resonated with you, if you've had your own family twist moment, reach out. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, remember, family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. The Family Twist podcast is presented by Savoir Faire Marketing Communications and produced by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.